Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
March 17th, 1776, Boston, Massachusetts. After 11 months, 11,000 British soldiers and civilians were being evacuated from the city. The siege of Boston had begun in April 1775, after General Thomas Gage had led British forces out of Boston toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. A rumor had told Gage and his commanders that the colonists had gathered arms and supplies for the rebellion against King George, including possibly some cannons in Concord. Gage was an experienced British officer. He had served the crown during the French and Indian War and had been appointed commanding general of North America and a lieutenant general in 1763. In 1774, after the Boston Tea Party, Gage was appointed as military governor of Massachusetts, charged with suppressing the rebellion in that colony. In April of 1775, he would lead the military expedition to Lexington and Concord. The operation was a disaster for the British. At Lexington, at dawn on April 19th, the British encountered 80 militia drawn up on the town green, the central square. A British officer advanced and told these men to disperse, calling them damned rebels. In response, an unknown person, British or American, fired. One British soldier was wounded, and then the regulars advanced on the militia and scattered them. The action at Lexington aroused the countryside and inspired more militia and Minutemen to gather at the town of Concord. They ambushed the British at Concord and convinced the outnumbered and exhausted British troops to retreat back toward Boston. The British were dogged every step of the way by the colonials, shooting at them from every bush and rock along the road to Boston. Once the British reached Boston, the colonial troops placed the town under siege. They fortified the only two land routes out of Boston, Boston Neck and Charleston Neck. Over the next few weeks, militias from the surrounding colonies arrived to swell the size of the army besieging Boston. Gage continued to receive supplies from the Royal Navy, as the Americans lacked the naval strength to blockade and close the port of Boston. On July 17, 1775, the British attempted to break out of Boston by assaulting Charleston Neck, specifically colonial positions on Breed Hill and Bunker Hill. It managed to drive colonial forces off these hills, but suffered enormous casualties in what became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, losing over 1,000 men and costing Gage his command. As a result of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the ongoing siege of Boston, on July 2, 1775, a new commander for the colonial forces arrived, George Washington. Washington had also served with the British Army during the French and Indian War and was a Virginia planter. He had been elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1775. When he learned that Congress was going to appoint a commander for the troops around Boston, he wore his own uniform to the session and was appointed as commander. When Washington arrived, he immediately set about bringing order and discipline to the troops around Boston, appointing professional officers and organizing a professional supply system and a system of drill and discipline. To break the siege, Washington wanted to launch an attack during the winter of 1775-1776, but his officers convinced him that it would be a disaster. Instead, he dispatched Colonel Henry Knox, a Connecticut bookseller turned army officer, to Fort Ticonderoga in northern New York to retrieve 60 tons of cannon, which had been captured by General Benedict Arnold. Knox organized a strenuous march down the Hudson Valley to Boston and successfully brought the cannons to Washington on January 23, 1776. Beginning on March 3, 1776, Washington moved the artillery that had come from Fort Ticonderoga to bombard the city of Boston. Washington occupied the Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston in one night, to the astonishment of the British Army. In response to the fortification of the Dorchester Heights and the artillery bombardment that followed, the British decided to evacuate the city. They had to wait for the wind to be headed in the right direction, and then, on March 17th, the army finally managed to evacuate the city. The British Army would make its way to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then in August would be reinforced and would invade New York City. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress would enact the Declaration of Independence and formally establish the United States of America. This was made possible by the success of the Siege of Boston.
This has been 3 Minutes of History. I'm Chris Oxenford. Thank you for joining me.